I want to do a video today on Myers-Briggs typology and its relevance and implications for elite law school admissions. So what prompted this was I came across a post on Quora, of all places, and it was a response to a question here: which learning style suits each MBTI type the best? And there's a post here which I've linked to, which provided a breakdown of the four big types and how they tend to respond to different educational settings. So the first group is the censor judgers. These are also sometimes known as the guardians. And the author here, Holly Hayes, argues that the SJs who just four types, ESTJ, ISTJ, ESFJ, and ISFJ, constitute about 40% of the population, and that most public school boards adopt an educational approach that is, by and large, tailored to their needs or their learning style. And not only is it tailored, but also the vast majority of teachers, or at least a disproportionate number of teachers, tend to be the SJ type, and I would argue that they're almost certainly specifically the SFJ, censor, feeler, judgers, just by virtue of the fact that teachers tend to be, well, at the grade school and secondary school level, tend to be predominantly female. And other things that give the SJ an advantage in traditional public education are the fact that they tend to learn well through rote memorization. They tend to be good at recalling detail. And they also generally operate well in organizations that require a great deal of adherence to certain structures. Now, okay, so the second category is the SPs, censor perceivers, who tend to feel understimulated in classroom settings, and their skills are just in other forms of education. The NPs, the intuitive perceivers, these are often people who are very bright, but prone to be underachievers, and they tend not to do as well in formal school, but they are quite intellectual. And then finally, the NJs, the intuitive judgers. And these are people who they tend to set academic goals for themselves from a young age. They tend to be very ambitious and goal-oriented. They tend to be good at self-directed learning. They tend to have trouble in public schools sometimes because they're overstimulated by a lot of the socializing and social nature of school. They need more time than other students to process and absorb new materials. They're prone to perfectionism, even sometimes maladaptive perfectionism. And they tend to be good at more visionary, outside of the box thinking. And so there's a lot to think about here in this post, but I want to focus specifically on the implications for elite law school admissions, which is what I know a little bit better. And one of the remarkable things is that the NJ personality type, which this blog post gets into, appears to be highly overrepresented in elite law schools. Now, it's hard to find precise data on this, but I remember when I was in law school, one of my classmates sent out a survey to the Wall, as it was called, which was basically the school-wide email list, and he basically asked everyone to respond with their Myers-Briggs type. Now, obviously, I think this was not a scientific poll by any means, and I think that it probably was prone to sampling bias, simply, if nothing else, by virtue of the fact that intuitives tend to be more interested in Myers-Briggs types than censors. But the the results were pretty remarkable nevertheless. It ended up getting 145 responses, which isn't bad for a school which is relatively small like Yale. And 72% of the respondents were intuitive judgers, which is pretty remarkable considering that intuitives, like all intuitives, are only about 25% of the population. But here, just intuitive judgers, these 4 types among the 16 in the Myers-Briggs typology, were accounted for 72%. And what was actually even more remarkable to me is that of the 72%, you had the INTJ, the introverted intuitive thinking judgers. This one type out of the 16, which is only about 1 to 3% of the population, comprise 36% of respondents here. And then there was a drop-off with the rest of the NJ types being roughly equal. The INFJ was 15%, ENFJ was 11%, ENTJ was 10%. So I wanted to talk about, first of all, why it is that the intuitive judgers appear to be so overrepresented, especially in light of the finding here by the blog post, or at least the theory that the censor judgers tend to perform best in traditional grade school. And I think that it has to do with a couple of factors. So I think one is that the nature of or what's tested or what's required to perform well academically in a college setting, is quite different from the K through 12 type, where there is much more of an emphasis on, first of all, focus learning. So you obviously tend to have a major. It tends to be, especially for the type of people who go to law school, they tend to take courses that are much more oriented around writing detailed research papers, which involves more self-direction, more motivation, more research skills, much more reading generally, and there tends to be a correlation between a propensity or ability to read well and enjoy reading and an intuitive personality type. So I think that a lot of that gives intuitives an advantage. And then I think the judgers tend to outperform perceivers in a college environment, and especially in the law school admissions game, by virtue of the timeline and the margin of error that's involved in elite law school admissions. So when you look at what it takes to get into a top 5 or top 10 school, you're looking at average GPAs that tend to be just very, very high, well over 3.9 in some cases. And then this is a GPA that has to be sustained over basically a 3.5 to 4 year period. And so I think this tends to favor judgers who just tend to be a little bit, if not as intellectual as the intuitive perceivers. They tend to be better at meeting deadlines, of getting things done in a more structured environment, of generally responding to incentives, being on time, etc., which I think, even if you're talking about only a marginal difference in ability, this can certainly account for even a small fraction of a GPA difference, which can appear to have an outsized impact by the time you get to law school admissions. Now, I think the second big reason for it is that letters of recommendation matter a great deal. And as you'll see if you click on the Quora link here, there's a good chart here showing the breakdown of the personality types between teachers in a grade school or high school situation versus college. And there's an enormous difference between the NT types, how much they're represented in high school versus college. The NTs, the intuitive thinkers, these are known as the rational types. These are people who tend to be, just by nature, logical, analytical, research-oriented, and these people tend not to gravitate toward high school teaching, but they are vastly overrepresented at the college level. And and so when you have an admissions situation where letters of recommendation play a very important role, it's natural that you would have NTs specifically, like the INTJ, but also just intuitive judgers generally just relate a little bit better to the teaching and the rigor and the style of professors who are NTs or NJs of some sort or the other. So they're probably just going to have a leg up in letters of recommendation. And then I think the third big reason has to do with the LSAT and what the type of intelligence that's being tested here. I think obviously the LSAT, like standardized tests in general, are to some degree simply a proxy for IQ or a G score, which is general intelligence. But I also think that it's not obviously a straight IQ test, that it does tend to privilege certain skill sets or types of intelligence, namely, obviously, reading comprehension, and then more general aptitude when it comes to analysis, logic games, etc., which I think would generally not only advantage an intuitive judger, but also just would be more interesting. And when you're looking at a test like the LSAT, where you can get pretty significant gains just by studying and practice, I think it's natural that an intuitive judger would just take more of an interest. And I remember actually, I began to study for the LSAT with the goal of getting into law school, but I actually found, as bizarre as it sounds, that I actually came to enjoy the process of studying for the LSAT itself. At the risk of downplaying the value that I got from the legal education itself, as I look back on what I really learned out of the totality of the law school experience, I actually think the process of studying for the LSAT itself just did a lot to make me a more rigorous thinker, and so I got a great deal out of that process. Now, so this points to a number of things to think about. I think obviously, one has to wonder, in these law school admissions processes, which are obsessed with diversity and representation and whatnot, that you have a pretty small slice of the population in terms of personality type really dominating this process. And I think that one has to think about, do we really want to be producing a cohort of lawyers for the top schools who embody these specific personality traits? I don't know. I think that one could debate that either way. Obviously, there's a question here: are people of certain personality types, do they make better lawyers or legal practitioners? I don't know, but my interest in this is more what it means for law school admissions and what it means for people who are aiming to get into law school. I think if you followed some of my work and writing at the American Conservative, you'll see that I've taken an interest of late, really looking at the genetics and the psychology of achievement. And I find it remarkable that we, in our society, when it comes to athletics or music or fashion, etc., we are, as a society, are quite comfortable and open in talking about genetics. And so you look at ESPN, for example, all day they're talking about how someone's height or weight or whatever, how it might bear on their ability to be a top tier athlete. And then we, of course, do that in the entertainment realm as well, where we talk about people's looks and whatever. But for a variety of reasons, we don't really apply the same rigor in thinking about genetics and psychology when it comes to intellectual and cognitive achievement. If these indicators, if this data that I presented, both in the Quora post here, but also just in terms of the survey that I shared for my law school class, if you have here, one of 16 personality types, which is 1 to 3% of the population, comprising well over a third of the class at Yale Law School, there's something going on, especially considering that I at least in my view, personality type is largely determined by one's genetics, and it is an innate trait. And what I think the lesson is, first of all, is whatever you think of personality tests generally, at least in the context of elite law school admissions, I think it's worth taking a test and trying to figure out what you are. And obviously these things are on a spectrum, but I think just knowing generally among these 16 types where you fall is going to be instructive. Okay, so once you know what your type is, I think that depending on what your type is, there's I think it points to different lessons for how you approach law school admissions. Now, I think if you're an NJ personality type, intuitive judger, and specifically if you're an INTJ, this is good news, because now you know that there's at least some indication here that your personality type is congruent or in some way favored with what's required to get into a top law school. And I think that this is an important thing to realize and come to terms with for a number of reasons. I think one, that knowing that INTJs do so well and NJs do well generally in the admissions process can help you, I think, rid yourself of a lot of different limiting beliefs that you might have acquired from your K through 12 education, especially if you have the misfortune of going to a public school. Because odds are, if you were an NJ, and I would argue especially a male NJ and especially a male NTJ, you probably just didn't quite jibe with your ESFJ teachers. You were probably frustrated by the time pressures and generality and rote memorization, and I would even say, to some degree, the anti-intellectualism of public schools, and I think that can often even lead people who are obviously intelligent to underestimate the degree to which they are intelligent and capable of intellectual achievement in a school setting. And I think that I think the literature in self-help, self-development, in generally studies of outlier achievement, I think they just show over and over again that if you believe that you can succeed, you believe that you're in a group that is a high-performing, high-achievement group, that this can really matter. And a book here that I would actually recommend to you is a somewhat recent book by Amy Chua and Jed Rubenfeld. Amy Chua you might recognize as the Tiger Mom, but both she and her husband are both professors at Yale Law School. And they wrote a book recently called The Triple Package, which basically looked at the rise and fall of different ethnic and cultural groups in the US and why some tend to achieve and some tend not to. And one of their findings is basically that all these groups that are overperforming, that are overachieving, they believe that they're in some way special or unique or gifted and that they're destined to achieve. And whether or not it's true, I mean, these things are to some degree just mythology. Nevertheless, these beliefs lead to almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, where if you believe that you succeed, you believe that you're part of a group that's going to succeed, that's just going to make it more likely to happen. So definitely, I think there's an advantage. I think there is a real advantage here, generally, that intuitive judgers have. But obviously, if you can sort of take on the belief or so forth, that's just going to amplify that effect. Now, I think it's a more complicated situation for applicants who are not of this intuitive judger personality type, because even when you account for sampling bias and other things, I think the reality here is that there probably is something going on, and I don't think that not having a favored personality type is a reason not to go to law school or not to aim for a top law school. but what I think it does call for is a recognition that your genetics and for example, if you're an SJ, your genetics, unlike maybe what might have been the case in earlier parts of your education, may not, if they're not working against you, they may not be working for you, and you may be up against a competition that is, that just has some kind of a personality or psychological edge. And so I think the first thing to consider here is, if you don't have this NJ personality type, what is your ambition in the law or in terms of your career? And, and if it is something that requires or that will be furthered by really going to one of these top 3, top 5, top 10 schools, I think one has to think about whether or not that's realistic or whether or not it's something worth expending effort in. I'm generally of the view, as much as I would benefit from a lot of people applying to law school, that doubling down on your advantages and allowing your genetics to work in your favor is probably the more fruitful long-term goal. But if you decide that this is something you want to do and so forth, then I think what it calls for is having a plan or a strategy that is not conventional. Because if you try to play the conventional game where you get a 4.0 GPA, you max out your LSAT score, you get to know professors and work with them and so forth, it's going to be an uphill battle. But I think that as much as this talk might sound like I'm engaging in type bias here, I think each of these 16 types have different talents, different advantages, different gifts that they can bring to the table. And the question that I would ask and urge you to think about is, if you're not one of these NJ, and especially if you're not an INTJ personality type, is how can you take what you're naturally good at? How can you take your inherent advantages, and then how can you channel them or steer them or come up with a strategy for law school admissions that allows you to double down on your strengths and get an advantage over these NJ types, while meeting just like the baseline requirements that you need in order to be competitive. And I think this is obviously how you approach this will depend on your specific circumstances and so forth. It's something that you can work with a admissions counselor or advisor. But I think the overall takeaway here is to think about personality type, think about why it appears to have so much predictive value and explanatory power, and then think about how this research and insight applies to your own situation as you're navigating the law school exam.